Hello everyone, I want to talk to you about cultural relativism and tolerance because the idea that cultural relativism implies that we ought to be tolerant is so instinctual to us, and we need to chase that instinct out of our minds. We need to annihilate this idea that we have that cultural relativism and tolerance go together, because it turns out they don't. So you have a lot of cultural relativists walking around saying cultural relativism implies that we ought to be tolerant, or cultural relativism and tolerance tend to fit together quite nicely. And we think, of course, that cultural relativism would imply that we ought to be tolerant. But that is actually a bad argument. It turns out that cultural relativism does not imply that we should be tolerant. So let's first talk about the reasoning for thinking that cultural relativism would imply that we should be intolerant, and point out how that reasoning is bad. So on the test, I want you to recognize, to be comfortable with this idea that there is no connection whatsoever between cultural relativism and the idea that we ought to be tolerant. The two ideas are separate, and cultural relativism does not even imply that we ought to be tolerant. So why would someone think that? Well, if each culture determines the content of morality, if each culture constructs what is morally right or wrong by their attitudes of approval or disapproval, then one culture is no better than another. Each culture is correct. Each culture is infallible when it comes to its own moral code. So let's say culture A practices infanticide and cultural B doesn't practice infanticide. It's not that culture B is better than culture A. Each culture determines what's right or wrong. So infanticide is literally right in culture A and literally wrong in culture B. And therefore, no culture is uniquely correct. No culture has a monopoly on moral truth. Now you might think that if each of these cultures out there are correct in their moral code, if each constructs what is right or wrong relative to the culture, then surely we ought to be tolerant of other cultures, because our culture is no better than any other with regard to morality. We're just different. We're just different. Just as my ice cream tastes aren't any better than anyone else's. I'm just different. So, that reasoning looks good. It turns out that it's not. That even if cultural relativism is true, it does not follow that we have to be tolerant of other cultures. Here's why. Everything here is going to stem from the definition of cultural relativism. An act is right when the majority of the culture approves of it. So if that's the case, there aren't any universal moral truths. There are no moral absolutes. An act is right only when the majority in a culture approve of it. So, to use this sort of reasoning, cultural relativism is true, therefore everyone ought to be tolerant, is an invalid form of reasoning. Why? We move from the claim that cultural relativism is true to this claim that everyone ought to be tolerant. But that's a universal moral truth at best. That's a moral absolute. And surely a cultural relativist can't align themselves with moral absolutes. That's inconsistent with their theory. They deny that there are moral absolutes. So to go from the claim that morality is relative to cultures, and when I say that, I'm not talking about the fact that cultures have different moral beliefs. That's obvious. That's trivial. You'll find that throughout this course we're not talking about what people believe. We're talking about the nature of rightness itself. So when I say morality is relative to cultures, according to the cultural relativists, what I'm saying is that what is literally right for one culture could be literally wrong in another, because their attitudes of approval or disapproval may be different. So if that's true, if infanticide can be literally right in one culture and literally wrong in another, if there is no universal moral law that we discover, a moral absolute that says the killing of infants is wrong, if there is no such universal moral law, then morality is relative to cultures. Therefore, it makes no sense for a cultural relativist to endorse relativism, but then, as a result of relativism, go on to claim, therefore, everyone, regardless of race or creed, ought to be tolerant, because that's to move from a cultural relativist claim to a moral absolute claim. And cultural relativists can't endorse moral absolutes. Their theory doesn't allow for it. So that's the first problem. Even if cultural relativism is true, you can't get from there to the claim everyone ought to be tolerant, because the claim everyone ought to be tolerant is a universal moral claim that's supposed to be true, regardless of what the culture approves or disapproves of. But relativists can't acknowledge that. Morality is determined by the culture. The culture determines what's right or wrong. So that's the first problem. And you'll notice that in the book, when I talk about this, I'm talking about the box, the big box with text in it that says reply to. So there's a section where I talk about cultural relativism and tolerance in the first chapter, and then I have reply to a few pages later, and what I'm talking about right now is the second reply. So we've been talking about the first half of the second reply. Now another problem. There's another reason why cultural relativism does not imply that tolerance is a good thing. Cultural relativism is true and act is right when the majority of the culture approves of it. Therefore, any act can be right as long as the majority of the culture approves of it. Therefore, intolerance can be right as long as the majority of the culture approves of it. You see, if cultural relativism is true, intolerance can be a good thing as long as the majority in your culture approves of it. So suppose you're a member of a culture that approves of intolerance and the oppression of other cultures and taking over other cultures. Well, then that's right relative to that culture. If that culture goes around oppressing other cultures, taking over those cultures, they're doing the right thing, because an act is right when the majority of the culture approves of it. And as long as they have the majority in their culture on their side, they're doing what's right. So as you can see, cultural relativism does not imply that tolerance is a good thing. Not at all. For one, the claim that everyone ought to be tolerant, that tolerance is a good thing, period, is to make a universal moral claim, is to commit yourself to a moral absolute. And cultural relativists can't acknowledge the existence of moral absolutes because that's completely contrary to their theory. A moral absolute is something which exists independently of how we think or feel about it. It's something we discover. But according to the cultural relativists, we make up what's right or wrong by approving or disapproving of something. Secondly, if cultural relativism is true, then it turns out intolerance can be a good thing. What do you need? Just the majority of the culture approving of intolerance. So we're trying to sever this connection here between cultural relativism and tolerance because there is no connection. Now, you're going to have to work on this because it's such a habit of ours to think, well, cultural relativism is true. Surely we should all be tolerant. And when you look at the theory on the face of it, it seems that if anything is clear, that it implies we should be tolerant. But when we are a little more careful, we see it doesn't. So try to get rid of that instinct on your part. The instinct to think that if cultural relativism is true, tolerance must be a good thing. There is no connection whatsoever between cultural relativism and tolerance. In fact, cultural relativism can imply that we ought to be intolerant. One of the objections that I talk about, the first objection to cultural relativism, talks about how if the majority is right, then if you're in the minority point of view, you're automatically mistaken. You're just out of luck. And therefore, when you say the majority support infanticide, but I think infanticide is wrong, you're actually speaking utter gibberish. So imagine you were listening to a speech given by Martin Luther King. And at a particularly climactic moment, he pounds his fists on the podium and says, "Racism is supported by the majority, but racism is wrong." And the crowd claps. They're cheering him on. If cultural relativism is true, his claim is utter nonsense. It's like his saying that triangles are four-sided, or that there are married bachelors, or that you can be taller than yourself. Here's why. Let's take the claim racism is supported by the majority. According to the cultural relativists, rightness equals being approved or supported by the majority. They're one and the same thing. Wherever you have rightness, you have being approved or supported by the majority. Wherever you have being approved or supported by the majority, you have rightness. So, unbeknownst to Martin Luther King, he was actually speaking gibberish, because if the two things are identical, you can always substitute one for the other in a sentence, and still the sentence will have the same truth value. We're not doing anything harmful to the sentence. We're not restructuring it in a way that it looks absurd. If Samuel Clemens is Mark Twain, and I say Mark Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn, then it's also true that Samuel Clemens wrote Huckleberry Finn. because Samuel Clemens and Mark Twain are the same person. I don't know if you knew that, but Mark Twain's real name was Samuel Clemens. So if these two people are identical, there's just one person. Then if I say Mark Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn, it's okay for me to substitute into that sentence Samuel Clemens, because it's also true that Samuel Clemens wrote Huckleberry Finn. So if right equals being approved by the majority, and Martin Luther King said racism is supported by the majority, but racism is wrong, we can substitute being supported by the majority with right. And what do we get? Racism is right, but it is wrong. If cultural relativism is true, unbeknownst to Martin Luther King, he's really speaking nonsense. Now, forget about cultural relativism for the moment. Just be yourself and ask yourself, if you were listening to a speech by Martin Luther King and he said racism is supported by the majority but racism is wrong, do you think he would be speaking nonsense? Do you think he'd be contradicting himself? Do you think his claim would be gibberish, like saying you can be taller than yourself, or that you can exist and not exist at the same time, or that there are four-sided triangles? If you say, surely he wasn't speaking gibberish, his claim makes sense at least, if not even being true for that matter, then you can't be a cultural relativist, because cultural relativism implies that Martin Luther King was speaking utter nonsense. He's contradicting himself. When he says racist policies are supported by the majority but racism is wrong, what he's really saying is this: racism is right, but it is wrong, and that claim is utter nonsense. So, what we're doing here is we're taking cultural relativism and we're just drawing out the implications. We looked at, in the first part of the chapter, good reasons for endorsing cultural relativism, and then we're looking at objections against cultural relativism. And what we do is we take a theory, we draw out the implications, and if the implications are absurd, that gives us a reason to give up the theory, to say there's something wrong with the theory. So what you do is you take the reasons for cultural relativism and the objections against cultural relativism and you weigh them. And if you think the objections are stronger than the reasons for cultural relativism, that gives you a reason to reject cultural relativism. Now, when I was talking about tolerance and how cultural relativism does not imply that we ought to be tolerant, I wasn't arguing against cultural relativism. I'm only saying we need to be consistent if we're going to be cultural relativists. We need to recognize that the theory does not imply that we ought to be tolerant. So I've explained that there is no connection between cultural relativism and tolerance. I've talked about the first objection to cultural relativism, so I hope that clears up some things. On the test, for instance, I find that students often put what they feel to be right rather than what I'm asking them to memorize. In the assignments, in the discussions, I'm asking for your own views. However, on the test, I'm asking you to master the masters. I'm asking you to master the best arguments for cultural relativism, the best arguments against cultural relativism. So suppose on the test I say, you're speaking with the cultural relativist, and the cultural relativist says, since cultural relativism is true, everyone ought to be tolerant. And I say, how should you respond to this person? And I give you several different choices. One of the choices will say this: well, to say that everyone ought to be tolerant is to make a universal, absolute moral claim. And cultural relativists cannot consistently make universal, absolutist moral claims. They can only say this: you ought to be tolerant only if the majority of your culture approves of it. That's it. They can't say, regardless of what culture you're in, everyone ought to be tolerant. So that would be one of the answers. That's the answer I'm looking for, because I'm asking you to master the best arguments for and against cultural relativism. I'm not asking you to say, well, how do I feel about this argument? I'm asking for that when we do the discussions and assignments. But to reason well about morality, you need to expand your toolkit. And to do that, you need to master the masters. You need to master some of the better arguments for and against particular views. And once you get those inside your head, then you can pivot off of them to develop your own arguments. You know what sort of considerations are relevant. You know the defects of certain views, and that if you're going to be a cultural relativist, for instance, you need to be able to handle these objections to cultural relativism. So I hope that helps. Let me know if you have any questions. I haven't gotten any questions about ethics yet, mostly questions about the online course, and sometimes D2L isn't cooperating, and I apologize for that. But please email me any ethical questions that you have. Also, I pointed out on D2L that I've got a webcam, and so if you have a webcam, we can set up a time to talk if you want to talk face to face, so to speak, about any ethical issues or anything in the text that you're not quite understanding. So I hope all is well, and I'll talk to you later.